Today's episode is a special one for two reasons. Firstly, it's a small milestone in the life of the Missionary Minds podcast. It's our 50th installment, and we thank each one of you for joining us along the way. The second, more somber reason is that the same day this episode was recorded, our parents and sister, that would be my in-laws, were the victims of a house robbery in which our sister was held at gunpoint and the home was emptied of most of the valuable possessions. We're thankful that no one suffered physical harm, but we do ask that you keep them in prayer. Those events were providential in light of this episode. All the way from Bokota village in Limpopo, South Africa, we bring you Missionary Minds, where you can learn about family, church history, biblical worldview issues, and of course, missions, all from the mind of a real-world missionary of almost 20 years. Buddy Seth, today our title is How Does One Persevere Through Pain in the Mission Field? And I'd like us to start off by you telling us your experience and why you no longer live in the village.
I moved here single, and then when I went back to get married, I knew that I wanted to live in a rural area. I had already spoke with Amy, my fiance at that time, about moving to Mozambique, and she had said, seeing as I haven't lived there yet, why don't we try South Africa, where at least you can buy and you can buy with a visa and drive on cement roads, and there's hospitals, and why don't we start there first? So we took our money from our wedding and we built a house in South Africa's rural areas, which is not as rural as Zimbabwe's or Malawi's or poorer countries, but we built our house in a village called Makungele, about 25 kilometers from Lewis Tricart. So we lived there. We moved in 2006, and that's where we lived, and all of our children, our first 4 children, were born there. And when we say rural, we mean there were no Americans, there were no white people, there was no English. The water, there was one tap in the corner of the dirt road, and then all the houses would come to that tap with wheelbarrows and line up. The tap would be turned on 3 or 4 times a week, and then that tap would have a long line of jugs waiting at it where people would fill their jugs and get water. So that was the attitude or the environment in which we built our first house. So we lived there, and things were going along as missions will. But after we'd been there a number of years, and of course all the experiences that you'll have crossing cultures, in 2014, I think it was the 2nd of December, that morning I had a root canal. That evening, my wife wanted to paint. So we were painting the kids' room, one of the children's rooms, and we had moved them all into the other end of the house. And there was a door in the other end of the house. We left it unlocked. It was now 9:00 at night, and we left that door closed but unlocked because outside we were washing paintbrushes in a tap and then come in and wash, and the kids were in that room that we had to walk through. So maybe 9:30 or so at night, while we're in there, I was actually reading a book to my wife. It's over there on the shelf. Mathematics, Is God Silent? A fascinating book that Amy chose. She said, I want to get a grip on philosophy from a Christian perspective. So I was reading that book to her as she was doing the painting. And then Caleb, who at that time was 7, came in and said, Dad, there's a man in our room. And I thought it was our next door neighbor, who maybe I mentioned before, was an 18-year-old boy who had already broken into our house and had threatened my wife with a metal rod on a separate occasion while I was at church. So then I came charging back and said, Eugene, get out of here. And that's when the door opened up and a gun was placed in my forehead. So the man shouted, White man, US dollar. And he did not wear a ski mask or anything to cover his face. There were 2 other men with him, so there's 3 guys total. And as soon as I saw saw that, I just turned very humble. Well, Milabayini. In Tsonga, what do you want? We'll give you what you want. And he replied in Venda. So since he didn't wear a mask, and since he didn't reply in Tsonga, I took it that he was not, and I didn't recognize his face, I took it that he was not from that area. But then they switched quickly to Sutu. Our area is not Sutu. So we said, we'll give you what you want. Take what you want. Then he said, US dollar. So he had to know this was the house with white people and they're Americans. So we tried to offer him things, but we didn't have any important amount of money, maybe $50 in South African rands. And we tried to give him those things, but they weren't happy with that. So as I was leading him back to a place where we had whatever it was, the 800 rand or whatever, as I was taking him there, then he clubbed me over the head with his gun. So I fell to the floor, woke up, there was blood pouring out because it was a head wound. So that just came down all over my face. Then the men grabbed my wife, 2 on my wife and 1 on me. And then for the next 15 or 20 minutes, they went through the house, beating my arms, blood, whatnot, all around. So it was a traumatic and prolonged experience for both of us because they beat my wife as well as they would take her throughout. But then it was escalated much worse when they grabbed Caleb and Carson, who at that time would have been only 2. And they put one of the 2 guns, 3 men, 2 guns. They put one of the guns on Caleb's head and said, I shoot your boy. And the Lord was so kind in his providence. So 1 gun is on my head, 1 gun is now on Caleb's head, 1 man with me and 1 man holding Amy and another man on Caleb. And that kind of experience, well, our Lord promised that in that moment he would give you what you should say. So I said in a desperate kind of plea, Caleb, pray. Please don't kill my son. And Caleb prayed. And I mentioned this in another time, but this is all recorded on a lengthy document that Amy wrote about 2 days after, maybe the next day after this happened. So we would not forget any of the details because we don't want to exaggerate or make things up. But Caleb said, as best we can remember, the exact words were, "Oh God, open their eyes. They're blind." And for a 7-year-old boy to say that, shaking and crying, "Oh God, open their eyes, they're blind." And the gun came down immediately. That was clearly the draw card. They could have gotten anything we had by torturing the children, but the gun came down. Then they took me to the study, my study, and I offered them the money from the church, it was kind of a joke because we only had 200-300 rand from the money from the church. The church had nothing, but I offered them the money from the church as a distraction because there was a bucket with the church cash in it, and so 2 of them went with me in there, and Amy begged the man to be able to hide the kids. So they said, okay. So we hid the children. She hid the children with permission from the criminals under one of the beds where we had been painting. And then they proceeded to ransack the house, but it was punctuated with violence. And Amy was pregnant with our 5th child, Cameron, and they beat her in the stomach, bruises and blood everywhere. And then after, again, it sounds 1 minute is long. 5 minutes feels like a year, but they were there for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then they went through through each room. And then eventually they said, pardon the language, but this is the words they used. And I think the exact quotation is important because it reminds you of the depravity the animal nature and the fierceness. But they said, I sex your wife. So, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. And then they began to undress Amy. So at that point, man, you're gonna have to kill me for that. So I reached out, grabbed one of the guns, and maybe surprised the man. But I've heard often that criminals are cowards. I saw that night. I was able to wrench the gun out of his hands, put it in his eyes, and pulled the trigger. And there were no bullets. And I've had people say, not many, but 2 different guys mentioned, aren't you grateful that the Lord didn't allow that gun to be loaded so that you wouldn't have that man's life on your conscience? And my thought is no. If God had willed, I would have been very glad for that gun to have been loaded so men would know to what degree I love my wife and what you should do if someone tries to touch her. But the gun wasn't loaded. So I shouted, Amy, they've got no gun. We had just finished reading Alan Patton's book, Cry the Beloved Country. He's a South African. It's a famous novel, maybe the most famous South African novel. And in that book, the criminal who breaks into the book is all about a criminal named Absalom who breaks into a man's house and shoots him, but he only has 1 bullet. And we just read that book. So we said, they've got no bullets. And man, I've got such a great wife. She picked up one of the broken pieces of furniture. It was a desk, that desk right there, that keyboard tray. And she smacked it over the guy's head. And then a fight ensued. And a few moments later, the second gun, which was now maybe 2 meters from me in our living room, he pulled the trigger. And how you can miss from 6 feet away, from 2 meters away, that's difficult to understand. But he did miss. And
who was he aiming the gun at?
He was aiming at me. And he pulled the trigger. When I realized there was no bullets in the first gun, I fought with it for a moment, but then I didn't care about that. We grabbed chairs and whatnot. And then that man actually left the house. And then the other man with the second gun pulled the trigger on me as I was beginning to chase them out of the house, to chase that first man out of the house. So I stepped out of my study into the living room. Man pulled the trigger. He missed. So I, in kind of a rage, said, they have no bullets. And I just charged him and punches. And I don't know how to fight. I don't know how to throw punches. But I hit him, and whatever that means, it went back and forth. Chairs were thrown. Our table was knocked over. Doors were knocked off the hinges. There's still, in that house, there is still a door up with a hole where a chair was thrown. And that knocked that particular door off the hinges. So, but then they left one after another. And then when I turned back to see what Amy was, then the one guy came running back in, the guy with the gun. And so we fought another time, and then he took off. So we just assumed, Amy and I always assumed then that he only had 1 bullet. What's remarkable is months later, I on evangelism about 2 kilometers away in Magangeni, I met a man who, when he saw me, he said, Hey, Wena, hatiban, we know each other. We are brothers of blood, he said to me. And I thought, I don't know this man. He was a security guard at a school. And he said, let me show you. I was shot too. And he was shot actually below the belt, and the bullet entered in his body and left with leaving no long-term damage. And he said, hey, yeah, we were shot the same night. They came to me at 10:15 p.m., which is another way we know the timetable, because they came in just after 9:40 p.m. with us, and they came to him at 10:15 p.m. And they cut the lights at the school, and he showed me the chair, because I was at the school when I met the guy. He showed me the chair he was sitting on, and he showed me the lights they cut. It was over 25 meters. And they shot, after they shot me, same gun, they shot from 20 to 30 meters away and hit a guy in the dark. And they didn't shoot me twice, and they couldn't hit from 2 meters away. When God says this far and no farther to the waves, he can say this far and no farther to anyone's life either. So that was an encouragement to us. Then they shot again. After they shot that man, he crawled away into the bush and laid there bleeding. And they shouted out, in Venda, we're going to finish you, but they couldn't find him. So they stole all the computers from the school and left in a car. They caught another man on the road, and that man laying in the bush heard them shouting, and then the police caught the man beaten on the road. So they had a number of bullets, but they didn't shoot again in our house by the will of God.
So you've taken us to this point where you've had the traumatic event in your home, and these men have gone on, and there's a demonstration of the providence of God. What did it look like after that? Whether there was any more drama the rest of the evening or the next day, following days? Well,
we eventually found out that the criminals came to us from our next door neighbor. Our next door neighbor, a man and woman with their children, we had already helped them previously. The child came running to us about a year earlier, late at night, saying, Dad's hitting Mom. And I ran over there and separated them and tried to help them, separated the husband from the wife and tried to help them and whatnot. Well, the husband and wife both went to the city, Johannesburg, and while they were there, the wife's brother came to stay at that house. We found out later, the next day, we found out that the police said, hey, don't trust that guy. That guy is a criminal who's been guilty of homicide, murder. And I said, why isn't he in jail if you know he's convicted? They said, oh, he was in jail. We just let him out because there's no more space. I'm just telling you what the police said to me, but they said, do not trust him at all. So then I said, wait a minute, what about this and this and this? And we put two and two together. And then we talked to our neighbor, Hendrik. And Hendrik said, hey, I saw that guy that is the convicted criminal. He was there the night that those guys attacked. He was there a few hours earlier, standing outside, meeting with people and pointing and directing them. I watched him and I said, hey guys, what are you doing? And they said, oh, we're just getting business ready. So that was as night is falling, 4 or 5 o'clock, and then they come in at 9 o'clock at night. And they were standing where Hendrik showed us that they were standing is at the corner of the house where you can see the side door where they would have had to enter. But the house where the homicidal criminal was at was on the opposite side of the house. So he left his house, walked up around to the other end of our house, stood there in the street talking with some men. Hendrik said talking with some men, which we are surmising are the men that came in. So yeah, it was a string of events like that. So the police, when they actually arrived that night, they added to the stress. They put taped lines, don't cross lines all around the inside of the house and whatnot. But forgetting all that, the next day, as we began to try to put the clues together, it's only circumstantial evidence because they couldn't trace the fingerprints that they took. They found fingerprints, but they couldn't trace them. But it's circumstantial evidence that our neighbor called the criminals to come, and that's why they weren't afraid. They weren't afraid because they weren't from that area. And then after making some crime that night, then they left. So then we went back to the U.S. for about 8 weeks while we tried to recover a little bit from the trauma. It's a very heavy thing, especially for a mom, to be pregnant and beaten and almost raped and to have guns on the children's head.
And can you tell me a bit about that, preparing to go to the U.S.? What are the next steps that come after a night like that? What were the discussions like with your wife and the planning, and all of that?
Well, it's all surreal. Surreal, I mean, it seems like the memories are kind of plastic. in my memory, if that's the right adjective to put on them. Stretchy and like you're looking through them from some kind of glass that it doesn't feel like you can see or think of things exactly as they happen. So maybe I won't even remember things accurately. But what I remember, and whose memory is accurate, what I remember is I mostly want to help my wife and kids, but I'm still very much clinging to, I want to be a missionary. And I, as a man, recover more quickly, and my wife as someone who has to nurture and protect 5 very weak people, who's right now in the process of growing another very weak person, and who's in the process of losing that child, who by God's grace, she didn't lose, though there were all the marks that that child should not be alive, but that child had his 8th birthday 2 weeks ago, by God's grace. And so I said, sweetheart, we'll do anything that we need to do for our family. So we took 3 days away at a friend's house. A friend opened a house and said, please come stay with us for 3 days and let us stay for 3 days at their house. And then I said, okay, let's just go there, behind lock and key for a few days to think about what to do. And then Amy said, let's come home. And so some friends offered to pay for us to fly back to the US. And we flew our family home. And we put 8 weeks on the ticket because you have to put a going and a coming back day. But then we said, we'll cancel if we have to. Let's just see what we're going to do. So we went home to the US for 8 weeks and just took time to let the natural emotions go through their turn, and then discuss what would be a wise, godly, biblical way to move forward. And I'm very grateful for a wife who's very much a woman, very much feminine, very much a mother. She would not be a missionary if I were not a missionary. When people say, oh, is your wife called to be a missionary? Her answer is always, I don't know what you mean. I'm called to my husband. If he's called to be a missionary, I'll go with him. But no, I'm not a street preacher. I'm just a woman who wants to raise a family and cook dinners and have families. That's what I want. And that's what I want in my wife. And but she's willing to follow me. And so we had to ask, is this the right thing for us to do, to go back or to stay? And after a few weeks, Amy said, I think we can go back, but I can't live in the village again because now I mentioned that the homicidal criminal was to our south. That is 5 meters to our south was the homicidal criminal. Perhaps, if you'll remember earlier on, there is an 18-year-old that's 5 meters to our north. So we have a house 5 meters to the south on our property where when we came back from Joburg one time, they just squatted on our property and we had the chance to tell them they have to move, but we decided, oh, we'll let you stay. So we just gave them that bottom 30 meters or so of our property. They took that, and that's where the criminal was who called the other criminals, at least we believe, according to circumstantial evidence. Then to the north is the 18-year-old who broke into our house and then threatened my wife with a metal rod. Then to the west, that is about 7 meters to the west, you could see the house from my study. From that desk, sitting every day, I could see another man. This man was a convicted criminal and let out on multiple accounts of theft. And he had actually told me, this is months before December 2014, he was just let out and he's now living to our west. And I met him and tried to do Bible studies with him. And he said, oh, I'm a thief. I said, oh, well, you mean you stole, but that's not what you are. No. I am a thief. Himinakamba. Wait, that's how you define yourself. Yes, I'm a thief. You can't stop me. I always have to steal. I said, does that mean you'll steal from us? Haha, maybe. That's what he said. He has 2 sons. His sons came into our yard. They were both 7, 8 years old. They're Caleb's age. They came into our yard one time while we were eating lunch, and I can look out the front window, and the 2 boys walk into our yard stealthily, apparently not realizing we can see them from the table, steal the bike and walk out. And I see them. So I just walk out the door and then they start to run. But I know where you live. You live 7 meters from my house. So I walk over to the house. I say to the man, these kids just stole. They're your boys. What are you going to do with them? 2 boys. He says, Ish, what can you do? That's the way we are. So that's the scenario in which we're living now. We're now living in a place in the last 12 months where one house to the north is an 18-year-old who's broke into our house and then threatened my wife later on at a separate incident with a metal rod. To the west is a man who says, oh yeah, I'm a thief, that's what I am, and maybe I'm going to steal from you. And then the boys actually do steal from us. And then one house to the south is a homicidal criminal. And to my wife's eternal credit, and I trust eternal glory, she said, I will move back there, but you've got to get 2 of the 3 to move. And so we worked out that we would move back to Africa and that I would go and talk to the chief. And they were going to have to get those criminals to move. We've heard African justice and Ubuntu, and they would protect you and help you. So I talked to the chief, and they would not get even 1 of the 3 to move. So we decided to move out of the village. I talked to my wife. I brought look, we'll put up a wall, we'll put up a fence, we'll put up gates, we'll get security. But, I think Amy was probably right in her recognition that if you can't get the criminals to move, if you can't get any protection or help from those in the area, you can put up walls, you can get dogs, you can do what you're going to do. But how much protection do you have if you know on all sides of you there are convicted criminals who tell you they're going to do it again? So we moved out of the village.
Yeah. And in your thinking from moving out of the village, where did you then move to? How did you decide on that area? And how's it been since?
So we moved from the village. We moved 25 kilometers to the west to the town of Lewis Treecart, where I currently sit right now. And we rented a house. And then eventually we found this house. And we tried to purchase this house so we could live here. And we have a 6-foot wall, a 2-meter wall, or 1.8 meter wall. And we put up electric fencing and bought 2 German Shepherds. And we put burglar bars and burglar doors and lock. And we thank the Lord for security. We thank the Lord. Amy now sleeps through the night for most nights, but for months, years afterward, she would wake up commonly in the middle of the night, shaking, crying. It does something to a husband to know that often your wife wakes up crying just with bad dreams again, that the kids are being beaten. And she's willing to follow me and she's willing to serve the Lord, but it is a heavy weight knowing I have to give her a sense of security. And there is no security outside of heaven. But when you can supply it, those things. And I'm so grateful for a wife that I've got.
Thank you for that, brother. And thank you for laying out the story for us. I'd like to go into some principal elements of your experience and what we can draw from that. And that'll be for the next episode, part 2 of this. So for today, to our audience, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to rate it and subscribe to keep posted with more upcoming content. Feel free to share this episode with someone who might find it interesting, and submit any questions you may want answered in a future podcast. You can email those questions to paulschleiline@gmail.com. You can also visit betweentwocultures.com for other resources like this. I'm your host, Yamikani Katunga, and until next time, that's it from Missionary Minds.